Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next games are versus Gumshoe for the arcade and Gumshoe for the NES. It's been a while, but we're back with another game that uses Nintendo's NES Zapper peripheral, and the timing here may not be a coincidence either. Looking back, I've played 3 games on the NES so far that use the NES Zapper: Wild Gunman, Duck Hunt, and Hogan's Alley. All 3 of these launched within a year of the Famicom's launch in Japan, and afterwards, Nintendo stepped back from making light gun games for a few years. Fast forward to the launch of the NES, and the Zapper ended up being a big part of the console's initial marketing, and Duck Hunt in particular was a pretty big hit. After this, Nintendo ended up publishing 3 more light gun games on the system. However, something interesting about these later 3 light gun games is that none of them released in Japan, despite 2 of them being developed completely in-house by Nintendo. That actually makes this one the very first game Nintendo made for the NES that never released in Japan. Nintendo themselves never really gave any official reason as to why these were not released in Japan. I can't help but wonder if the light gun games weren't really all that big of a hit in Japan, and once they saw the popularity of them overseas, they decided to make more strictly for the Western market. It's also possible that for Japan, the Zapper was just a one-and-done deal, and they just figured that in Japan, the market had moved on. There's not really any sales information on these later light gun titles, so I can't help but wonder if they didn't do all that great in the West anyway. Like many games that never get released in Japan, these titles unfortunately tend to be overlooked by Nintendo themselves, and they've never really gotten any attention outside of their initial releases. Come on, Sakurai, both Wild Gunman and Hogan's Alley get cameo appearances in Duck Hunt's moveset. Where's Mr. Stevenson? Anyway, Gumshoe was made by Nintendo R&D 1, and it was designed by Sakamoto, the primary designer behind Wrecking Crew. Sakamoto said that Yokoi asked him to make a new light gun game, and Sakamoto's initial ideas revolved around a ball that would bounce whenever you shot it. This evolved into a game where shooting the main character with the zapper would make him jump. Humorously, Sakamoto said that he designed the main character, Mr. Stevenson, based on Yokoi without even initially telling him. I don't totally see it, but maybe it looked a bit more like him in the initial concept art or something. Similar to many prior NES games at the time, this one also had a Versus system release that, as far as I can tell, came out before the NES version. Now, we're actually getting to a point where Nintendo's first-party offerings on the Versus system were starting to slow down as they began to shift focus on a different method of bringing their NES games to the arcades, the Play Choice 10. This arcade machine had actually already launched at this point, but I've neglected to talk about it since I won't be playing most of the games on this system. Basically, this arcade machine would let arcade goers play NES games for a limited amount of time, and it essentially just included the same ROMs from the NES games, so I'm considering them to be unchanged ports for the sake of the challenge. I'll talk about it a bit more in the future though, since there is one title I will be playing on it eventually that did receive a handful of changes. However, I did want to bring it up around here at some point, since it explains why we're going to suddenly stop seeing Versus system ports of most of Nintendo's first-party NES titles from here on out. Because the Versus system version came out first, that's what I started with here. In this game, you play as the titular Gumshoe, Mr. Stevenson. If you're like me and don't know what a Gumshoe is, it's basically just a slang term for a private detective. Immediately when starting up the game, I received a letter from someone called King Dom. He apparently kidnapped my daughter, and he's forcing me to obtain the 5 Black Panther diamonds for him to get her back. The manual doesn't reveal a whole lot more about what these diamonds even are, although it does tell us that Mr. Stevenson is an ex-FBI agent. This game is kind of interesting, as it is basically a really early autorunner. Mr. Stevenson is always walking forward, and you have to shoot him with the NES Zapper to make him jump. I'm not totally sure what the implications of this even are. Is this just a weird jump input, or am I supposed to be actually shooting him, causing him to freak out and jump? You can even do this while Stevenson is in the air, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. On the topic of the shooting, since I am playing the Versus system version here, I'm not actually using a light gun, unfortunately. Instead, I'm using a crosshair and aiming with a mouse, which definitely doesn't completely replicate the feel of the light gun, but it's the best I can do. Also, fair warning with this one, sometimes I shot the screen like crazy, so you may want to sit this one out if you are sensitive to screen flashes. Making Stevenson jump isn't the only thing you need to manage either, as the game is full of enemies and obstacles you need to shoot down. In this level alone, you have birds that attack, cars that come out of nowhere, and these random bottles flying through the air. There is also these skull blocks you need to avoid, which will make you lose a life if Stevenson touches one. In Gumshoe, you have a limited number of bullets, but they can be refilled by making Stevenson touch these balloons laid out throughout the stages. Thankfully, shooting Stevenson himself doesn't actually cost any bullets though. Generally speaking, I didn't usually have an issue with running out of bullets in this one. The first level seems to just be taking place in the city. After a bit, while I was still getting the feel for this game, a car came out of nowhere and ran me over. Geez, watch where you're driving, would you? You have a limited number of lives in this one, and once you lose them all, it sends you all the way back to the beginning. Great. Eventually, while I was making my way through the stage, I found one of those diamonds the letter mentioned. You can in theory not grab this, which I think prevents you from beating the game at the end. I grabbed every diamond I saw though, so I never got to see what actually happens if you don't collect them all. The rest of this stage isn't too bad, but these massive armadillos come out of nowhere near the end, and you can only shoot them when they stand up near you. What the heck are these things doing in the middle of the city? Man, this game is kind of bizarre. At the end of the stage, you take an elevator up to the next level. Something funny about this next stage is that the music for it is completely changed in the NES version, and most people speculate that it's due to how similar it sounds to Walking on Sunshine by Katrina and the Waves. While the scenery isn't all that different here, you're just on the rooftops of the city instead, there's a sizable jump in difficulty. The level is just covered in skulls, and certain aspects of the physics make them pretty tough to dodge. Whenever you hit a ceiling, you bonk and fall straight down. This can make it really tough to navigate through tight areas, and sometimes I just had to shoot like crazy to inch my way forward. Combine this with the way you bounce off of walls and the fact that every jump is a commitment, and you've got a pretty tough control scheme. I already got my first game over on this level. Ouch. Level 2 also introduces some new enemies, including these brutal massive bullets that explode into a ton of tiny pieces when you shoot them. You've only got 1 HP in this game, so all it takes is for you to make one mistake and you'll lose a life. On my next run, I found out that there was another diamond on this stage too, but I kinda failed to get it and went straight into a skull. Whoops. Soon after, I got my second game over already. Man, I'm getting way too many game overs this early in the game. This is gonna be a tough one, isn't it? I finally beat level 2 on the next run, and at the end, you find a telephone booth. I'm not totally sure who is calling here, but I think it might be King Dom himself, because he said he would contact me in the letter. Anyway, he tells me that I'll get a note from an islander named Adamosde. Alright then, I guess I'm going to see an islander next. How am I going to get there? By boat? Nope, the next stage is a water stage, and Stevenson decides to swim the whole way. Man, this level can get really hectic. There's not as much stage navigation in this one, but it sends tons of quick sea enemies at you at once, including a shark that has to be hit twice to actually be defeated. At first, this level was really tough for me. I got 5 total game overs on this level before I finally beat it. However, I eventually realized that it was a lot easier than it first appeared. A huge chunk of the enemies can actually be completely ignored, which allowed me to focus more closely on the bigger threats like the sharks. Additionally, the enemy spawns are pretty consistent in this game, so I eventually learned when the sharks spawned to make sure I was always ready to deal with them. The diamond in this level is super easy too, and it's basically impossible to miss. Finally, after many attempts, I beat level 3. At the end, you find Adamosde, and he just gives you a note sent by King Dom. I wonder why he couldn't have just told me this over the phone, or through whatever delivery method he used for the letter at the beginning of the game. Anyway, the letter tells me that King Dom is waiting for me in Zuli's jungle. At the time, I had no idea who Zuli even was, but the manual says that he is apparently some sort of monster that lives in the jungle. Next up is the final level already, the jungle. Man, this one is brutal. I may have thought that level 3 was tough, but it was nothing compared to this one. The thing that made this one really tough is that bombs are constantly falling throughout the stage. If you don't shoot them quickly, they explode into a ton of pieces. While you can dodge the explosion, it's much easier to shoot the bombs, but you have to be quick, and often I wasn't quick enough. Hold on, where are these bombs even coming from? Come to think of it, why is everything out to get me? I'm helping King Dom find the diamond, so he can't be the one attacking me. Maybe it's just bad luck and everything hates Mr. Stevenson today for some reason. There's some new enemies here of course too, and these grasshoppers were surprisingly tough. Something about their jumping pattern and hitbox made me miss them often. There's so much you have to deal with quickly here that sometimes all it took was one miss and it was all over. There's also this rhino enemy that I think can be destroyed with enough hits, but I just jumped over him instead. Man, I lost so many lives to this level. I died over and over to the bombs and grasshoppers, and I even was starting to get pretty frustrated at this one. Having to start at the beginning of the game with each game over was really annoying too. I eventually reached this section with some kind of lake below me, and here I found the 4th diamond. Only one left to go. A bit later on in this stage, you find another phone booth. Wait, a phone booth in the middle of the jungle? Huh? Anyway, this time King Dom gives you a machine gun and tells you to fight Zuli. Apparently, the monster of the jungle has the final diamond, and I need to get it from him. It doesn't seem like the greatest idea for King Dom to arm his enemy with a machine gun, but I'll take it. There's still a bit more to the stage after this, and you don't even get to use the machine gun yet. Mr. Stevenson just holds it in front of him and does nothing with it. Finally, I reached the game's one and only boss, Zuli. Again, I didn't read the manual, so I was really confused by this encounter. To be honest, I wasn't even sure what was going on for most of this game. Why the heck is there a random monster bursting out of the ground? Anyway, I immediately got destroyed by this guy and got a game over. Ouch. During my next encounter though, I started to figure out how he works. During this fight, Mr. Stevenson is just constantly shooting his gun, and you have to hit Zuli in the eye a ton to take him down. However, he's shooting projectiles at you that you need to constantly dodge. I didn't realize it at first, but you can actually shoot these projectiles. However, they move so fast that it was pretty risky to do it anyway. My strategy for this boss was just to hop in the air constantly and dip down when I noticed an opening between his attacks. This wasn't completely free though, as it only took one mess up for the whole plan to fall apart. The problem with this strat was that it was super slow. I felt like I was on this guy for forever. Eventually he started flashing white, faster and faster, which I knew meant I was close. Finally, I destroyed him and the final diamond was obtained. I guess it's time to get my daughter back from King Dom. Will Mr. Stevenson really just give him the diamonds though? Of course not. Like the hero he is, Stevenson blasts off King Dom's hat and makes him surrender. I knew it was a bad idea for King Dom to arm Stevenson like this. Anyway, his daughter runs out and is reunited with her father. After this, Stevenson thanks me, the player, for helping him save Jennifer. I guess this means you actually are playing as someone else and not just Stevenson in this game? Maybe I'm a sniper or something that was helping him in the distance. Like many games at the time, the game just has to loop, even though it doesn't really make sense with the story. You end up getting a message saying, but later that same day, and you find out that King Dom has captured Mr. Stevenson's daughter once again, and all the diamonds are back to their original locations. I'm not really sure what's going on with these diamonds, but come on Stevenson, you should at least watch your daughter more closely at this point. Anyway, with that, Versus Gumshoe was complete. On to the NES version. The arcade versions of these are often harder, so surely this one can't be too much worse, right? I've actually got the NES Zapper this time, which will make things a bit different too. I don't know if I'm weird for this, but I think I actually prefer using the Zapper over the mouse. Other than the fact that my arm eventually gets tired, I like the fact that I can always move my arm to the exact position I need to, while with the mouse there's a layer of translation happening between the movements of the mouse and the cursor on the screen. Initially, I tried to play with some distance between me and the TV, but I eventually gave up and ended up pointing it directly at the screen since it's a bit easier. So a lot of this game actually ended up being essentially the same, with one exception. They added an entire desert section to the first level, and it has one part that is pretty ridiculous. Most of it is pretty free, but there's this one section with falling rocks that is frankly one of the hardest parts of the entire game. They just fall so fast, and it's really hard to actually hit them without missing at least once. I did get better at it with time, but man, it messed me up a lot when I was first getting through it. To make up for it, they added a new power-up that can only be obtained in this section of the level. Sometimes the birds will drop something called the power drink, and getting one of these will upgrade your clothes to pink, which will allow you to take an extra hit before losing a life. That's not all though. If you drink a bunch more of these power-ups while pink, you'll even get upgraded to green, which will give you a handful of extra hits before you lose it. This armor makes a huge difference, since normally a single hit will make you lose a life. Not only is this essentially giving you way more tries, but since you aren't actually dying, you aren't losing any progress on each hit either. It took me a bit to get good at grabbing all of these every time though, so it did take me a while to fully take advantage of this. Of course, I still wasn't completely off the hook. I got 2 game overs to those falling boulders alone, and that jungle level was still pretty brutal. I ended up losing a handful of runs to the final level too, including one where I made it to the final boss, but I sadly failed to beat him. Finally, on my 7th run through the game, I reached Zuli with the green armor still, meaning I could even take multiple hits on this guy and still be fine. I still decided to play it safe though, and after a grueling fight, I finally beat him. The ending cutscene is the same here too, so with Jennifer saved, my time with Gumshoe was complete. On to the reviews. These games feel like the first time the NES Zapper was used to make a full game and not just a tech demo, which I think is good. The game is also pretty bizarre, but I think it's kind of fun how strange it is. That all being said, unfortunately, not everything here works. The game just gets way too hectic, especially on the later levels, and it's frustrating that a single miss can make everything fall apart. I think having more of those armor upgrades would have gone a long way. It also would have been nice if the game overs just reset you back to the beginning of a stage and not back to the start of the entire game. While I appreciate the game conceptually, there are just some aspects that can make it really frustrating to play. I gave both versions of the game a 6 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.